The Americans were housed in the Livadia Palace, where the talks were to be held. Built in 1911 as a summer retreat for the Tsar and his family, this Italianate mansion, 4 miles outside the city, enjoyed panoramic views of the Black Sea and the surrounding mountains. Pug Ismay thought the Livadia quite lovely, but Pearson Dixon found the setting melancholy, steeped in memories of the Romanovs. Even the road along which we drove every day was built by them, and the whole landscape, with its trees and boulders, seemed still to belong to an imperial and luxurious aristocracy, he wrote to his wife. His colleague Valentine Lawford agreed. There is an air of sorrow brooding over the place, particularly the gardens that go down to the sea, he noted.
Welcome back to the Country House podcast, and thank you, Rory, for that wonderful reading, which is an extract from the new book written by our lovely guest today. Today we have on Tim Bouverie, the well-known historian, particularly specialising in the Second World War, and his new book has come out this week called Allies at War. It comes after his best-selling book, Appeasing Hitler. And Tim, welcome to the Country House podcast.
Thank you, Jeff.
Right, well, let's get cracking then. I suppose, well, firstly, congratulations, Tim. It's very exciting that this is the week. We're glad we've managed to steal you away from all of we know you have many, many interviews and exciting things. So the Country House podcast and our listeners are very happy to have you this morning. But could you just give us a brief outline of what Allies at War is about? Why did you decide to write it? What story did you want to tell, and why now, particularly? Sort of all of that kind of introductory stuff.
Well, Rory, the Second World War is obviously the most chronicled conflict in history, and thousands of books exist on every aspect of its military course and indeed the home front. Allies at War is different because it focuses on the politics of the war, specifically the politics of the Allies, the diplomacy between the British Empire, the United States, and the Soviet Union, but also all of the other alliances that were necessary to ensure victory, even the failed ones. So the failed Anglo-French alliance of 1939 to 1940 is a relationship which I don't think has received sufficient attention, not least because we all know that the alliance collapses in 1940 and ends in tragedy with the British sinking the French fleet at Mers el Kabir off the North African coast. And there are other aspects which I thought haven't been brought into the more well-known histories of the big three, that is Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, such as Allied relations with Francoist Spain. It was imperative that the British keep Spain from joining the Axis in 1940-1941, relations with Vichy France, with whom the British fought a 2-month very ugly war in the Middle East in 1941, relations with Greece, a country which the British Empire intervened in twice militarily in 1941 and 1944, relations with nationalist China, the supposed member of the larger club of allies that Roosevelt wanted to call the Big Four, and which had been fighting the Axis, or the Japanese specifically, since 1937. Relations with Poland and Yugoslavia, I could go on. But beyond that, the Allies were extraordinarily successful in battle, and the British and the American military alliance in particular was the most successful, collegiate, integrated, and sophisticated military alliance in history. And yet there was also deep-seated suspicions between the British and the Americans, and certainly between the British and the Americans and the Soviets. And this alliance was fractious, it was duplicitous, it was rivalrous. And I wanted to write a book which explored this, and hopefully, and I was glad that I was able to do this, drew on new material from the archives of the diplomats that operated below the level of the big three.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's this grand sweeping narrative about kind of Western, congenial Western leaders sort of, joining together to defeat evil. But of course, the truth is rather more well, not three, I suppose, because Stalin wasn't exactly very congenial. But anyway, but the point is that that it was a lot more complicated than we care to admit. But
Yeah.
you bring the characters Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill to life beautifully in the book. But and all the kind of wherewithal that comes with that. But there are some other characters, if you will, in this book as well, having leafed through it. Those are the architectural characters, the personalities of the extraordinary buildings in which these discussions, often fractious discussions, are taking place. We've got the White House, we've got Chequers, we've got all these palaces in Russia. Could you introduce us to some of the main architectural characters in the book?
Yes, certainly. Well, Chequers, which what is the Prime Minister's residence in Buckinghamshire, is at the centre of the story. This amazing Tudor Renaissance house in Buckinghamshire, which for at least 100 years now has been the country residence of the British Prime Minister. And Churchill went here every weekend, except for, and this is another house we might come to, when the moon was especially bright, when the moon was high and Chequers was considered vulnerable to German bombers. He was at Ditchley, the extraordinarily beautiful 17th century house in Oxfordshire, not that far away from the palace in which he had been born, Blenheim Palace. Chequers was a house that Churchill loved, and it was a very nice touch by Clement Attlee when Churchill lost the 1945 general election, that Attlee let him have one final weekend there. And it was here that he entertained a large number of important foreign dignitaries. But the house wasn't totally suited to certainly the tastes and comforts of the Americans. The heating system in wartime Britain and of the Tudor house was not up to the standards of Roosevelt's emissary, Harry Hopkins, who came over and stayed at Chequers on innumerable occasions, firstly to find out for Roosevelt whether the British were in earnest about staying in the war after the fall of France. But he gradually developed a very good relationship with Churchill, despite the fact that he spent most of his time sitting in the airing cupboard, because it was the only room in the house which he felt he could get warm. And later on, when he was confirmed that he was coming over to visit Churchill, I think in 1942, he said, "I'm on my way, turn the heating on."
I do that with my parents too when I go home.
Stalin's foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, also stayed at Chequers, and this was an extraordinary event. The Soviet foreign commissar did not normally go and stay abroad, but he visited first Chequers and then he went to the White House, and he brought with him a bevy of bodyguards who inspected the mattress, who looked under the bed, who were convinced that, as Churchill put it, infernal devices of assassination lay in every corner of the house. And the maids at Chequers, when they came to try and make the foreign commissar's bed, were shocked to find that he had a revolver under his pillow and that his luggage contained a half-eaten bit of black bread and a rolled-up cube of Russian sausage. Anyway, it was also at Chequers, by the way, that Churchill learnt about Pearl Harbor. He was in a really, really bad mood. He had, by total coincidence, the American ambassador, Gil Wynant, to dinner. And there had been all of these rumors that Japan was going to attack somewhere in the Pacific, that there was going to be a preemptive strike, but nobody knew where, and nobody knew whether the target was going to be British possessions in East Asia or American. And Churchill said to Wynant, "You know that if they attack you, we will declare war on them straight away." And Wynant said, "Yes, Prime Minister, you've made that very clear." And Churchill said, "And if they attack us in Malaysia, in Singapore, will you declare war and join us in the fight against Japan?" And Wynant said, "Well, as you know, Prime Minister, it depends on Congress. We don't know whether we can declare war. We don't know if we can join you in war. This put Churchill in such a bad mood, he said nothing really for the rest of dinner. And then at the end of dinner, he called for his portable wireless to be brought into the dining room at Chequers. And suddenly, the machine having crackled into life and some tank battle in Libya having been relayed by the newsreader, the announcer said, "We now bring you news that the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii has been attacked by the Japanese." And Churchill jumped up and rushed out of the room to his study, where he managed to be put through to Roosevelt in the White House, very early transatlantic telephone call, who confirmed that the Japanese had attacked the American Pacific Fleet. And as he said it, "We're all in the same boat now."
Was Churchill? I heard that he was quite chuffed about. It's not obviously he wasn't happy that Pearl Harbor happened, but he was obviously delighted that America finally joined the war after Pearl Harbor. Was he? Do you know what his mood was like when that happened, or not?
Oh, he was absolutely ecstatic. The moment he heard, as he was heading towards his study, he said, "We will declare war at once. I will make an announcement on the wireless this instant." And it was Wynant who said, "You can't do that. You can't declare war on the basis of a news item. I mean, what if it's wrong? Shouldn't we check that what you say has happened, what they say has happened, has happened?" And that led to the conversation with Roosevelt. But yes, as Churchill then wrote in his memoirs, he went to sleep and slept the sleep of the thankful and the saved. Pearl Harbor was a disaster, and what happened to the British in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in Singapore, and in Burma was the greatest string of British military defeats in British military history. But the involvement of America in the Second World War, which sprang from Pearl Harbor, ensured Allied victory, which had been in doubt before.
I had no idea that moment happened at Chequers. That's rather wonderful. In fact, it's sort of a highly appropriate place. I love it. The Tudors are famous. Elizabeth is famous for the defeat of the Spanish Armada, etc. And the fact that it should have taken place in a sort of appropriate building, that's absolutely brilliant. And
I
sad.
was reading Tim the other week. I was reading about Milton Hall in Cambridgeshire, which obviously was a seat of the Earls Fitzwilliam, now the Naylor Leylands. And Mrs. Thatcher was staying at Milton when she heard that I think it was the 30th of April, 80, or year was the Falklands War, 82, 81, 82. And it was sort of midway through, and she got a message through while she was at Milton at dinner saying that that the RAF had successfully bombed the airfield at Port Stanley, which sort of marked the sort of start of the turning of the tide in favour of the British in the Falkland War. So it's interesting, this constant relationship, not only between prime ministers and country houses and politicians and country houses, but specifically momentous events. And news coming through to country house weekend house parties is extraordinary.
Well, there's an almost better story, I think, about Ditchley. I don't know if you've covered Ditchley in your podcast before, but as I say, Ditchley was where Churchill went when he was told that he couldn't use Chequers because the moon was too bright and it was vulnerable.
It makes it sound like a sort of vampire house, Tim. Sort of when the moon comes up, Ditchley appears.
Exactly. Well,
it's actually a lovely house, isn't it? Very light and
stunning.
Would you say it's what, early Georgian?
I'd say it's restoration.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of the vibe.
And for our lovely listeners, just a bit of context, it was lived in at one point by Nancy Lancaster, who we talked about with Jane Churchill, her great niece, on that wonderful interiors episode. Nancy Lancaster, the doyen of the English country house look, renovated Ditchley beautifully, and it's no wonder the Prime Minister wanted to live there when he couldn't live at Chequers, because it really is a very, very pretty house. But it's surrounded by trees, isn't it? Well, it's not. It's got a park, but the park is surrounded by trees, isn't it? So it's quite well hidden. Is that right, Tim?
It is very well hidden. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's in a world of great estates where houses sort of shrink into them. But sorry, Tim, we interrupted you.
No, well, so Nancy Lancaster was married to Ronald Tree, who was a Conservative MP and an ally of Churchill, and I think half American, and
and she was fully American.
She was fully American and a great opponent of appeasement and supporter of Churchill's. He never got very far in government, but he put his house at the Prime Minister's disposal for the war. And it's on the night, so Churchill is staying at Chequers on the night of the 10th of May. Sorry, not Chequers, sorry. Churchill is staying at Ditchley on the night of the 10th of May, 1941. And this is the night when Hitler's party deputy, Rudolf Hess, bailed out of a Messerschmitt into central Scotland.
Yes.
And Hess was trying to reach the Duke of Hamilton, whose Lancashire seat was vaguely near where he had bailed out of his aeroplane. And this was one of the most, if not the most bizarre moments of the war. The deputy Führer of the Reich parachuting into the country with whom the Reich is at war, because he believes that he can negotiate a peace deal between Germany and Britain, which will allow the Germans to focus the war entirely against the Soviets. And he's chosen the Duke of Hamilton because he once met the Duke of Hamilton at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. The Duke of Hamilton was a famed aviator who was the first man to fly over Mount Everest. And he had been on the right, he had been on the pro-appeasement, even slightly admiring of Nazi Germany wing of the British aristocracy, but he had repudiated those beliefs after Kristallnacht. Anyhow, he'd never met Hess, so the whole thing was extremely random. And Hess broke his ankle on landing and was arrested by the Home Guard. And it's only once the Home Guard, which is, as everyone will know, is effectively Dad's army, has got him under lock and key that he reveals himself to be the Deputy Führer. And then back in London in the Foreign Office, another wonderful building, which not a country house, but something that you may have alluded to in previous episodes, Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary's private secretary, Valentine Lawford, holds onto a receiver and says to Jock Colville, Churchill's private secretary, "This may be a lunatic. He says he's the Duke of Hamilton, and something extraordinary has happened, that he's about to get in his aeroplane and fly down from Scotland to Northolt," that's the London aerodrome, "and that he wants to be met by Alec Cadogan and the Prime Minister's secretary. It's like an E. Phillips Oppenheimer thriller." So then they spoke to the Duke and they gathered that someone had arrived, and then Colville telephones Churchill at Ditchley. And Churchill just kept on saying on the telephone, "Well, who has arrived?" And Colville kept on repeating, "I don't know, Prime Minister, he wouldn't say." And then after a long time, Churchill said, "It can't be Hitler." Colville says, in very sort of matter-of-fact manner, "I imagine not, Prime Minister." He says, well, to which Churchill says, "Well, stop imagining and have the Duke, if indeed it is the Duke, sent down straight from Northolt." And so the Duke of Hamilton was driven down to Ditchley and explained that he really had met that morning in a Lancashire police station the Deputy Führer of the Third Reich.
That's fantastic. What happened to Hess later? Was he in prison for the rest of the war in England?
Hess was imprisoned for the rest of the war in England, and then he was sent to Nuremberg, where he stood trial for war crimes. He'd pretty much lost his mind by that stage. The important historical consequences for this were that this is just before the Germans had invaded the Soviet Union, just before Operation Barbarossa. And so the Soviet Union wasn't in the war on the Allied side. And yet the British had all this intelligence about Operation Barbarossa, and they had been trying to warn Stalin that Hitler was about to turn on his then ally and invade. But rather than be completely frank and say, "Look, we have no idea why the Führer's deputy has parachuted into Scotland. We have no idea what he's about, and he seems quite deranged," they decided to start a whispering campaign to the effect that the Germans really were trying to broker a peace deal between Britain and Germany, and that the Germans were determined to invade the Soviet Union as a consequence. And while that might be understandable from the perspective of alarming the Soviets and making them think that they couldn't trust the Germans, it also made Stalin convinced that you couldn't trust the British. And throughout the Second World War, Stalin was convinced that the British and the Americans could come to a deal with Hitler, and that a combined capitalist force of Germans, British, and Americans would invade the Soviet Union. And this had a distinct impact on his worldview and the sort of Europe he wanted to create afterwards, with a series of buffer states in Eastern Europe.
Well, thank you for explaining that, Tim. It's pretty Byzantine, isn't it? I mean, it's amazing how all these shifting sort of tectonic plates were kind of jiggling around. But I want to bring it back to the architecture. I want to ask you, I suppose, a big question, which we can probably then answer throughout the rest of the podcast through some more specific ones later on. But I mean, you've described these houses very well, being present during these momentous occasions throughout the war, and I'm sure we'll mention more. But how important do you think these buildings were, as it were, sort of stage sets to the drama of the war?
I think they were important. The great buildings at which the conferences took place, the Kremlin, Chequers, the White House, the Citadel in Quebec, Canada, the palaces at Yalta, the villas at Anfa Camp in Casablanca, the very large villas right by the Great Pyramid of Giza for the Cairo Conference. They gave a sense of occasion to what were some of the most momentous events in history. And I think that these great houses provided an added sense of occasion to what were some of the greatest events in global history. It wasn't always convenient. Sometimes those at a more junior end of the delegations would complain about a lack of bathrooms and having to share bedrooms with colleagues. And that even happened at the White House. When Churchill first visited the White House in December 1941 through to January 1942, when he made his famous declaration to both houses of Congress. This is just after Pearl Harbor, just after America has come into the war. The British delegation staying in the White House described it as a hugger-mugger affair. Or as the Americans said it, the upper floor of the White House was converted temporarily into the headquarters of the British Empire. The Monroe Room was converted into the Prime Minister's map room. Wherever Churchill went, he took an officer, a senior naval officer, and a series of screens with maps which charted the fronts of all the theatres and the positions of all ships as far as they could be relayed. And these maps were updated on an hourly basis. Churchill was given the Rose Suite opposite Hopkins' room. Every morning, still in his nightshirt and preceded by the inevitable cigar, he padded across the hall to review the previous day's discussions with Hopkins, who, as I've mentioned earlier, was Roosevelt's right-hand man. And I love this quotation from Lord Halifax, who is now Britain's ambassador to Washington. He said, "Certainly it is the oddest menage anybody has ever seen." And he made this comment as he's waiting to try and speak to the president, who is just being wheeled into the Prime Minister's bedroom, at the same time as Hopkins comes out in one dressing gown, then Churchill comes out in another dressing gown. Everyone's in a sort of state of undress. And as you both probably know, on one famous occasion, Roosevelt was wheeled into Churchill's bedroom when the Prime Minister was in a state of near or total undress. And that was when he said, obviously with mock grandiloquence, and it should be mentioned, not entire honesty, the British Prime Minister has nothing to hide from the President of the United States, or nothing to conceal from the President of the United States.
Such a good moment. Such a good moment. I love it. It's sort of, I mean, it's it sort of almost sounds like a sort of like a scene from a very serious sort of boarding school dormitory. They're all there in their dressing gowns, wheeling around sort of textbooks and maps, and kind of absolutely extraordinary. I mean, Sorry, I'm processing the images, Tim. They're wonderfully vivid.
The funny thing is, Timmy, I never know, because you hear all these true stories about Churchill, and then you hear stories that you're not sure if they're entirely true or not. You might be able to confirm this one. It's one of my favourites, which is not dissimilar. Clement's at the urinals. Churchill comes in, other end of the urinals. Clement goes, "Oh, Winston, are you feeling embarrassed?" And Churchill goes, "No, Clement. I just know whenever you see anything big, you try to nationalise it." Do you think? Do you think that's true? Do you think that's true, or do you think that's
I actually don't know. I've got a feeling that one might be apocryphal. Quite a lot of the best-known Churchill stories are apocryphal. The idea that he was caught in a state of total or near undress by Roosevelt has often been speculated that might be apocryphal. But there are three sources for it. Churchill, not only did Churchill mention it several times, but he told it in real time to Lord Halifax, who put it in his diary. So I'm pretty sure that, I'm not sure he was completely naked, but he would have been in a towel, and he was constantly having baths. Churchill's routine, which was something which had to continue wherever he was. And there are scenes which I describe in the book of him going to visit Stalin for the first time. And Stalin allows Churchill to stay in his own dacha, sort of just outside Moscow. But the British can't work the Russian tap system for whatever reason. And Churchill gets into a bath, which is scalding hot, and starts shouting at everyone because of it. On other occasions, he gets into various other locations. I think at Yalta, he gets into a freezing cold bath. But he's a man who has a nap after lunch almost every day, and that is followed by a bath before moving on to do some more work and then dinner.
Do you think the fact that Churchill wrote about his incident with Roosevelt when he was sort of in a state of undress, do you think it was actually quite calculated? The fact that he wasn't embarrassed by it, the fact that he wrote about it, almost boasted about it. Do you think that all of these incidents, do you think they were actually sort of quietly planned?
Well, Churchill later said that no lover ever studied the characteristic and whims of their intended amour as he did those of Franklin Roosevelt. But I think even Churchill would know that his body was not his strongest selling point, and that being caught in the buff by the American president wasn't exactly going to strengthen Anglo-American relations, even if it wasn't going to damage it. So I don't think this was premeditated.
Yes, it's perhaps not quite the appropriate level of dignitas that he was looking for.
Yes.
To ask another serious question, you talked earlier about how these amazing, quite a few more than I realized, spaces in which these conferences, discussions, conversations took place. Do you think that the style or the atmosphere of these spaces in any way shaped the outcome of the decisions made in them? For example, I know that when American politicians visit the UK, they're often very impressed by the age of the buildings that they're taken to. I mean, it's a slightly trite example, but you see what I'm saying.
I think it would be nice to say so, but I don't think so. Everyone comes to international negotiations with very strong national interests, and that was played out throughout the Second World War, and that is indeed probably the strongest theme of my book, which is that however much these allies were united in their desire to defeat Hitler, they all had their own national agendas, which were often in conflict with each other. They wanted to fight the war in their own way, to their own national advantage, and they wanted to create a world in which their country or their empire would be able to prosper thereafter. And I don't think that even some of the personal relationships that existed, certainly between Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin, the Churchill and Roosevelt kept on believing that their personal connection with Stalin would yield dividends, and it never did. So if a personal connection couldn't really have much of an effect, I'm afraid I don't think that the buildings were. I mean, people were impressed, and it created a good atmosphere. There were banquets in the Kremlin, which occurred. I mean, I can only imagine how large Catherine the Great's bedroom must have been, because the banquet took place on one occasion in, as I say, in Catherine the Great's bedroom. And the British ambassador, Sir Archibald Clark Carr, had a very enjoyable time imagining all of the dalliances that would have occurred in this room.
How extraordinary. Do you know how many
previously.
people were at the banquet? How many people would have been seated in that bedroom?
At least 40.
That's madness.
And these were extremely raucous affairs. The drinking was constant. The Russian tradition is to toast the whole time throughout dinner, and everyone stands up and makes a toast. And it's partly an element of comradeship, but Stalin also liked it because he liked to see his supporters get extremely drunk. And it's in vino veritas. If you are the most paranoid man in the world, as Joseph Stalin was, it is when your apparatchiks are drunk that they may reveal their true feelings towards you in some regard. And there was a theory that Stalin himself was often drinking water rather than the vodka, which everyone else was drinking. Beaverbrook tried to check, because every time in between having his glass topped up, Stalin would put a napkin over it. And Beaverbrook thought that this was to disguise the fact that he wasn't drinking vodka, although he certainly did drink a lot of Caucasian champagne or Caucasian sparkling wine. But Stalin claimed that the real reason for this was his fear of poisoning.
So he was, if you like Caucasian champagne, he was the definition of a champagne socialist or champagne communist.
Oh yes.
That's fantastic. He would have got on very well with Rory.
Now, play nicely.
No. While ordinary Muscovites were queuing for bread, and there was near famine in parts of the Soviet Union as a result of the German invasion and ongoing war, Stalin and his leading comrades were having vast repasts with caviar, quail, suckling pig, numerous hors d'oeuvres. I mean, it was extremely gluttonous and extremely bibulous.
It does sound very Animal Farm, doesn't it? I mean, we know why that book was written, but that's extraordinary. I mean, the disconnect is crazy.
It's very interesting. We were just talking about, the whole poison Stalin vodka thing, and where Jeff made his very off-color joke, which I shall be smarting from. Also, if we're going through the kind of whole like dictator thing, and I'm Stalin, does that presumably makes you Hitler then, Jeff?
No, Hitler was also a socialist. He was also a socialist.
I think I'm winning. Anyway, but no. I'm fascinated by this scene in Russia at the time when all of these politicians arrived in Russia. I mean, there was that wonderful film recently, The Death of Stalin, where we see inside the dacha, and it's all kind of total chaos. I mean, what was the dacha that he was in like, Tim? I mean, because that's the kind of the Russian equivalent of a sort of suburban villa country house, isn't it?
Yes. Well, didn't have a name. It was just known as State Villa Number 7, which has got a wonderful Orwellian ring to it. Just 8 miles outside the city. And when Churchill was taken there to stay in August of 1942, this was the time when Churchill had come out to the Soviet Union to break the news to Stalin that there would, in fact, be no second European front in 1942, an extremely disagreeable task, which Churchill likened to taking a lump of ice to the North Pole. The British didn't know that this was Stalin's own dacha, and they explored their surroundings, and they found it completely astonishing. Set in a wood of young spruce and Scots pine, the villa, a large concrete bungalow painted green, was protected by an inner and an outer wall, between which not even a mouse could have hidden, and a spanking new air raid shelter serviced by electric lifts. Inside, garish lighting revealed a decor of, as one British observer said, stylish utility, as well as a supper of red and black caviar, suckling pig, hors d'oeuvres, vodka, and Russian wines. It's to this villa, indeed, that Stalin flees effectively after the onset of Operation Barbarossa. He has something and historians are still in dispute about this because there's no real evidence either way. He either has something approximate to a breakdown, that this alliance with Hitler has turned out disastrously for him, that he may be responsible for the destruction of the Soviet Union, as he said immediately after the German invasion. Lenin created this state and we have effed it up. That's what he said to his comrades. So either he has a breakdown and he just goes to the dacha and nobody can get in touch with him, and he doesn't speak to the Soviet people, he doesn't rally the nation, he does nothing for several days. Or this is a ruse to try and draw out his enemies, those who realize that he is responsible for the lack of preparation for the German offensive, despite the glut of intelligence forecasting it. And when senior members of the Politburo, including Molotov, arrive at the dacha after several days of total silence from the boss, as he was known, the Vozhd, they claim that he opened the door and said, "What do you want?" in a tone which suggested that he rather expected that they had actually come to arrest him because of the disaster that was unfolding, whereas in fact they had come to say, "We need you. There is no one who can rally the nation like you, Comrade Stalin. There is no one who can prosecute the war. There is no one who can run the administration of this vast country like you. We need you back at the helm of government." And to a large extent, they were right. Stalin was a fairly disastrous military commander, but his attention to detail and his ability to organize Soviet defenses and obtain resources was impressive.
I think there are. Thank you for that. I think there are two sort of, one question following on from that, and one sort of final question I'd like to ask you, Tim. The first is still on this Russian theme, which is people have often commented about the slight dissonance between this radically, in a way, modern communist apparatus hosting these very significant conferences in the palaces of the dynasty that they had ruthlessly murdered. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Because the opening quote that I read, I think, riffs on that idea, and I think people found it, and to this day find it, slightly odd.
Yes, and it creates, as you said in that passage, and as the
well, as you said, not
as I said. Well, it had a particularly melancholy atmosphere. Crimea had also been the scene of a massive battle recently, so most of the landscape was dotted about with the vestiges of war, burnt out tanks. The Livadia Palace, which had been the summer residence for the Tsars, had to be completely rebuilt on the inside. It had been gutted by the Germans. Thousands and thousands of Soviet craftsmen and Romanian prisoners of war were put to work, rebuilding steps, installing bathrooms. The rugs in Roosevelt's suite were changed 7 times. His bathroom was repainted allegedly 8 times. There is this disconnect, and there are odd moments where the Soviet ideology comes up against the aesthetic. But on the other hand, Stalin realized that to win the war, it was important to not appeal to the Russian people as communists, to not appeal to them as Marxists, but to appeal to them as Russians. And in his first broadcast, he talks about Mother Russia. He doesn't talk about Marxism. He doesn't talk about communism, which, of course, is meant to be not a nationalist creed. It is an internationalist, socialist creed. And indeed, there was a revolution in the aesthetics of the Kremlin. When Churchill went there initially in August 1942, Stalin's study, known as the Little Corner, had photographs of Karl Marx and Lenin staring down from the walls. But by 1943, by which stage the Soviets had encircled and defeated the Germans at Stalingrad, these photographs are gone, and they had been replaced by portraits of Kutuzov, the great general who had helped drive Napoleon from Russia in 1812 and Peter the Great. And Stalin, around this time, makes himself a Marshal of the Soviet Union, a title, as I wrote, which he affected with Romanov-esque pomp for the rest of the war. So there is an admiration for the Tsars that Stalin has. He is called the Red Tsar, and he certainly enjoys living in an element of splendor. And I don't think he finds it contradictory to enjoy these great Romanov palaces at Yalta or elsewhere. But there's a funny moment. You mentioned that also the murdering of the dynasty at the Tehran conference in November 1943. The Soviets are based in the Soviet legation in Tehran, as is Roosevelt, because the Soviets have put it out that there is an Axis plot to murder Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin at this conference. Now, the British think that this is pretty good nonsense. They think that the Soviets have made this up just so that they can get Roosevelt to leave the American legation and move into the Soviet legation, where they can monitor him more effectively and they can eavesdrop, as they do with dozens of listening devices on his conversations. But on Churchill's birthday, which occurs during this conference, he hosts a dinner at the British Embassy, or actually, as it was then, the British legation in Tehran. And on the wall, as you would expect in many British legations, there is a portrait of King George V, the cousin of the last Tsar of Russia. And the Soviets are staring at it, and they suddenly say, you have, as you know, Rory and Jeff, there was a really striking resemblance between George V and Tsar Alexander II. They say, is that our Tsar Alexander you have on your wall? This seems a rather impolitic piece of iconography to have, and the British have to explain, no, you don't understand, that's our king. But it was often remarked that they looked very similar.
That's very funny. I love that. That's sort of, yes, oil painting photobombing.
And okay, you ask about the buildings. At the end of it, there's a wonderful ambassador to, he becomes ambassador. He's called Sir Rida Bullard, and he is our man in Tehran. And he doesn't play a major part in the conference. He really is just acting as host to the British delegation. But at the end of it, Churchill says that he's going to recommend him to the king for an honor, I think for knighthood. And Bullard says, well, that's very kind, Prime Minister, but I really haven't done anything for this conference. I don't think I deserve it. And he said, this conference is a moment of major history, and I have commissioned a brass plaque to be put in the legation here, which will commemorate the dinner that we have just had and the meeting of myself, the American president, and the leader of the Soviet Union. And I wish to do the same for you. And Bullard says, yes, I see now. You wish to place a brass plaque on me as well.
Very good. That's very funny. I like that. I think the final question then, to fast forward to today, we've often had, you just talked about Stalin being the Red Tsar. I mean, President Putin is often referred to as having czarist tendencies, and I couldn't help but notice when you're talking about these backdrops, Putin and indeed President Trump are very keen on using bling, architectural bling. I think in quite a similar way to the
dictator chic.
Yeah, precisely, dictator chic. There we go. What do you think that they use these backdrops in much the same way that the leaders did in the end of World War II to kind of convey power? Do you think that the use of grand architecture and politics actually hasn't changed very much?
No, I don't think it does. I think, though, that there is a difference. It reveals also more about somebody's personality. So Mar-a-Lago, I wouldn't describe as grand architecture. I would say it's a guy who's come from Queens and has had a social chip on his shoulder for a very long time, who now wants to emphasize quite how rich he is. And that's obviously also behind the architecture of his casinos and his hotels.
So it's a bit like the dacha you've described.
Yeah, huge vulgar buildings with his name on it. I think it says more about your own personal insecurities than it does necessarily about American power. And these other buildings can be tarnished. I mean, the White House symbolizes liberty, the equality before the law, checks and balances, all of the great things which were established in the American Constitution, and indeed so does the Capitol building, both built in a Greco-Roman style, emphasizing the founding principles of democracy, which came from the ancient world. These buildings are not immutable or incorruptible by what happens inside them and by their occupants.
That's really fascinating. Thank you.
I was just going to say, I do think that an element of, I suppose, all sort of leaders in some ways are drawn, think about the architecture, and I think about or the pomp. You think about not only everyone from Macron to Xi Jinping are wowed by being invited. We know that the Royal Yacht Britannia was the best floating embassy we ever had, because whenever anyone was invited on board, they were putty in the Queen's hands. And in the same way, I think even today, most leaders recognise the importance of grand houses, for example, especially because it feels like you're in someone's private home. From a diplomatic perspective, if someone's invited to stay at Chequers, they will be probably much more malleable than if they're invited to stay at number 10. Is that fair, Tim?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, I think people are very keen on that. And Margaret Thatcher understood that. She was trying to cut government spending in all sorts of ways, but she was determined that Downing Street should be redecorated. She was determined that the Foreign Office should be spruced up on the inside, that these are signs of British power. And it's a huge, huge mistake. And I think it may have been under the Blair government. It may have begun before, but I think a lot of it happened under the Blair government, that in order to raise money, the British government started selling off some of our amazing embassies abroad, because for reasons of history and status, the British embassies around the world are some of the great architectural jewels of those cities and some of the grandest. And they could obviously fetch a lot of money, but when you are relying, as Britain very much is now, and has been increasingly since the Second World War, since the events I describe in this book, on soft power, then having heritage and having beauty and having the instruments of soft power at your disposal is extremely important. And I think people would be less impressed if they were taken to some bungalow in Buckinghamshire rather than Chequers for a weekend. It's pretty inevitable, and that goes for people of whichever political stripe. As we've mentioned before, Stalin was obviously a committed Marxist and a committed communist, and yet he, more than anyone, enjoyed the pomp of the buildings which he was able to inherit from the Tsars.
Well, thank you, Tim. That's the Country House podcast is thrilled to hear this, that we are going to be instruments of soft power globally. But that's very good news. And thank you for a really fascinating podcast. This has been, I often think that some of the best ones are kind of slightly taking a slightly different angle on. Oh, yes, of course. And the book, forgive me, here I am wittering away. The listeners, should you have enjoyed this podcast, which I hope you have, you can read much, much more than what we've been talking about in Allies at War, which is out this week and is available from all good and probably bad bookshops, because it's going to be such a big hit. So please do take a look. I've already skimmed through it. It is very, very exciting. Tim is an extremely good storyteller, and he describes the architecture very well. So do grab that if you can.
On that note, thank you very much, listeners, for joining us. Tim, thank you for joining us today. It's been wonderful hearing from you. And to our lovely listeners, please join us again next week. And if you have any questions, please email us or fill in the form on our website. Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.